Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of Heiser Says, where tonight we have Dr. Richard Hames sharing us with a coffee. So, Dr. Richard Hames is a writer, futurist, entrepreneur, and mentor. He's currently doing a tour of Australia and has agreed to come and join me on the show here. The founder and director of the Centre for the Future, a fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science, and the founding partner of Hames McGregor and Partner. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Richard.
It's a pleasure, Florian. Thank you for inviting me.
So it's I came to your attention when you saw a kind of a news piece I did on a news.com article. For those from overseas watching, that's pretty much our tabloid here in Australia for the internet. That'd be a fair assessment, wouldn't you think?
I think so.
Yes. And in it, there were a few, shall we say, predictions or, provocative tidbits that they honed in on to attract attention. And Richard, you wanted to have really a long-form conversation to discuss your methodology in a bit more depth than you'd get from news.com. And
that's right. Yes, that
was
the motive. That was the motive for getting in touch with you, certainly.
Oh, see, there is some good comes out of these things. The stuff you read on the phone. It's good. It's good. There's a benefit to it all. So, I thought we'd start really by just introducing a bit about your story, and you're a futurist, or how do you like to phrase your profession or your trade, if you would?
Yeah, but it's interesting. Other people call me a futurist. I've always thought of myself as a strategist who's trying to make better sense of what's happening today. But inevitably, you get compartmentalized. You get put in a little compartment and labeled. And if people want to call me a futurist, that's fine.
So you're a strategist, really. And you work with business leaders and politicians, large corporates for future planning?
Yes, that's right. Really, again, it's making better sense of what's happening today in the deeper sense of that, understanding patterns and trends, and trying to fathom out what they mean or what they could mean in the future. Going out, depending on where I'm working, that can be going out 50 or even 100 years in places like Japan, for example.
One thing you mentioned in the article was to do with here in Australia, some of the issues that would be coming up would be water scarcity. And I recently did a video looking at just our population growth here in Australia and our water supply growth. And I was shocked that our population has grown 13 times faster than our infrastructure. And I'm talking about, freshwater dam storage.
Yes.
And I think it was 25% since 2000 our population's grown roughly. And about 1.8% our infrastructure to store, drinkable water has grown in that time period.
Yes.
So that got me quite interested to have a chat to you that when you're engaging with these people and planning out for these timeframes, are those the type of things that you're trying to bring to their attention, or just that you're bringing together in your systems and your thinking?
Well, very much trying to attract their attention around such critical issues, because the global conversation is focused on emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. In a country, first of all, that's very narrow-minded thinking anyway, because what we're actually witnessing is a global environmental breakdown. Carbon dioxide emissions is just one factor which is causing some heating, but there are numerous other factors like desertification, salination and acidification of the oceans, rising ocean levels, loss of species, loss of biodiversity, and all of that is connected. And so what I try to do, particularly with senior bureaucrats and politicians, is to try to get them to understand that in the in the particular context in which they're in, they have to think of the whole situation, but then drill down in terms of what that might mean in their particular geography. Now, in Australia, the most critical feature is water. You're right. And it's as important, or possibly even more important, along with soil degradation and the kind of monocultural approach to industrial agriculture that we're still using. Those three things probably are as important as emissions. And yet organizations like the Climate Council and the Australian Conservation Foundation, they're so limited in their thinking that they need to be borne out and challenged. Otherwise, we will miss the point entirely.
Well, if you'd allow me to indulge you, we years ago, and I'll just jump here, because I'm an architect by trade, and a lot of the viewers are aware of that, and you know we're trained to think laterally, and we did an exercise where we had to look at things from a global systems perspective. We really had to delve deep and go outside of our comfort zones to, if you're designing a building in this space, you need to think of the implications of that little building or that brief on an entire global perspective. And I mean, I quite enjoyed that. And, it's about the best thing I got from that was argument mapping and looking at pulling apart, different training systems, how education, how it all fits together, and then looking at pulling it apart from a scientific, universal interests and experience and just emergent concepts. Try and weave these things all together to get an idea and an understanding, to have an argument for why you wanted to do a particular thing. Mm-hmm. And one thing I found that I think might be relevant to your example dealing with the bureaucrats was the next year when I was brought on to teach the subject, was that trying to get people to think of things in that bigger global system implication and see how their little decisions here or their viewpoint can have a broader implication can be very hard. And a lot of people just don't want to think like that or aren't comfortable thinking like that. And if you even want to challenge them more to break out of their nice little ideological niche and question fundamental tenets of civilization, is democracy the best form? Or what if you shifted to another currency system or energy-based thing? And it was very difficult to get them to do that. And the way that I found it worked was to use scenarios, like probably crisis scenarios where, what decisions would you make? And for me, that was a fantastic experience. I loved it. And that was one of the reasons also why I was encouraged I wanted to talk to you. But I found as well that it's hard to get people to go through that process. Do you have difficulty getting people to think like that, or?
Yes, but I mean, there are, and essentially because the toolkit they're used to using, and that is common practice, if you like, the tools available to us aren't adequate anymore for dealing with complexity. So in order to be able to see patterns deeply and track trends, you have to be sitting in an immersive environment where you can actually visualize things. That's one thing. The second thing is, if you're visualizing that level of complexity, you need to develop almost a new language for describing what you're seeing, because using old language comes with such baggage that it's so easy to misinterpret and mistranslate what you're actually seeing. So there's a whole range of difficulties that we encounter when we're trying to explain to politicians and bureaucrats and senior people in corporations as well, the kinds of issues they should be thinking about, but cannot, because they're in this gridlock, if you like, which is a prison of our own invention, perpetuated by business schools and management theory and all the rest of it. And we just need a new toolkit to enable them to step into new epistemologies and see things differently.
Yes. Well, I mean, from my own tiny experience, I tried to get them to shift this ethical systems to be part of our professional practice subject, so architects can develop an ethical compass to frame their decisions as a professional.
Yes.
But instead, the problem was they moved it into a sustainability, and then it got watered down to the point where it was just driving one agenda, and then everyone's just putting green farms everywhere, and I got disheartened with it.
Yeah, it's easy to get disheartened. But a couple of weeks ago, I was attending a conference in Bangkok on ethics in AI. So the ethics of coding artificial intelligence and all of that stuff. And it was an OECD conference, but people from all over the world, including scientists and ethicists and people like myself. And it was actually very heartening to see the serious thought and attention that's being paid to such a deep issue. So it's patchy. Sometimes I come across groups that really can't break out of their current thinking, and yet at other times I'm participating with people who do that quite naturally.
Okay. One interesting thing that you mentioned, the issue with sea level rises, and that relates specifically to my example as well, because one of the young gentlemen there was from Tuvalu, and he was the son of one of the chiefs, and they were trying to really leverage that to get another project to look at the impact of resettling that large population there. But then, you've got local politicians here now where they're putting forward examples of where, the Pacific Islands are actually growing as well from the 70s. And one thing I'm dubious about, or I question, is when we see in the media the images of people, like, for example, with their houses washed away and all of these issues on these little islands, looking at it as a professional, you'd think, okay, why are they building those structures in that location? And, maybe it's more to do with the fact that there's a tradition of building in that location. They don't have the same understanding of modern construction techniques or even adapting them there. So I'm skeptical, and I like to question from both sides and bring it together. So
yeah,
you've got your Australian tour as well happening, and you're speaking in Melbourne and Sydney?
Yes, mostly Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra at the moment. We were going to be doing some public sessions, but they've had to be postponed until the end of August. The reason being there's been such demand from the media for interviews and explanations, TV, radio, and print media, and also from corporate boards and government departments in terms of wanting strategic intelligence briefings. So much of my time has been devoted to that. But interestingly, the Speakers Bureau has been inundated with requests, and so the demand for attending a speaking engagement of mine has gone through the roof. So we'll be doing quite a bit of that towards the end of next month and in early September.
Okay, fantastic. So when you're giving strategic advice or intelligence to these organizations, you obviously have models that you're using to give this advice. It's not a crystal ball. You're not tarot reading. There's a methodology and a scientific approach to it. Explain your models or how you derive at some of these predictions.
Yeah, I sold the tarot cards. They weren't working very well. The method is pretty rigorous. I mean, if you look at the field of strategic foresight, there is a knowledge base which is very profound, and there are associated methods and tools which are really extraordinarily sophisticated. So just in general, I'll try and keep it short, but in general, this is the kind of process we follow. First of all, we start with a question, finding the right question to ask for the group of people we're talking to, or the industry they're in, or what they're interested in finding out is absolutely critical. So we call that the focusing question. And when we've got the focusing question, we ask our algorithms, our AI horizon scanning capability, robots if you like, to scan literally hundreds of millions of documents that are available in the public domain online, to see if the algorithms can pick up any evidence, ideas, themes, topics, solutions, maps, whatever it happens to be, data around that question. We can do that in minutes, and it's quite extraordinary, the kind of synthesis of data that comes back to us. We then look at that and have, if you like, a team meeting to try and sort out what it all means, because we're trying to find patterns in the noise and to make sense of it. Then when we've made sense of it, and it reads more sensibly, or we've got some scenarios, or we've drawn some maps from that data, we will then choose to the people we send that to for their insights and input and feedback. And we have a community of about 3,000 trusted sources around the world. This is important. This is an important step, because what they're inputting is very much a polyocular, or if you like, a multicultural view of the data we're presenting to them. So what we get back is colored by different cultural mindsets, observing different things and pulling out different aspects from that data, to such an extent that we get information, rich information, which then becomes knowledge that we can use. With that knowledge, we then draft scenarios or do some backcasting exercises or whatever it is to find different contexts within the data set. Those contexts then define different probabilities for certain events happening over a particular time frame. And we can go from next year to 3 years to 5 years to 10 years, 20 years, and out even further. So that's that's a thumbnail view of the method. When we actually use that information to give to clients in the terms of advice, what we also try and do is find different ways of visualizing that information or expressing it in ways where they can, like you were referring to scenarios, where they can detach themselves from the reality that they're in and step outside into, if you like, a deconstruction of their belief system, such that they can begin to see alternatives to the options they're currently working with. So we frame the advice in those scenarios.
Is that possible for a politician that has a 3-year window of, that's the blinkers for the future they can see to the next election? Or are you trying to bash through that? Or is it not, politicians not the aim?
Politicians not the aim, leaders are. And by leaders, I mean leaders for the public good. People who have a sensibility and a moral conscience to use their position or their wealth or their influence in ways that will benefit humanity as a whole.
And do you go about identifying these leaders, recruiting them, finding them and working together with them?
Oh, very much so, because it makes our job easier. If we've got people with open minds and an inclination and a natural impulse to want to make sure that the future is better than the present, then it makes our life easier. If we're working with the average politician or CEO or bureaucrat that is focused purely on patching up the present, that makes life difficult for us, because it's difficult for them to open their minds sufficiently to accept advice which may be having drastic implications for things they're doing today. And it then we get the challenge. Then we get the challenge that it's not accurate, or we don't understand, or we haven't got time or the money to do that. There's pushback.
Well, I think pushback is probably a nice way of saying it. I think it'd be a challenging task. What about to appeal to a wider audience? I mean, you're familiar with Jordan Peterson and the success he's had on YouTube, just reaching out to people all around the world. And social media is the bane of people's existence in some regards. And I know you've predicted the demise of Facebook, and I hope you're right there, to be quite honest. But it
Did
also...
you watch the news earlier on today?
Sorry?
Did you watch the news earlier today?
No, what happened?
They're faced with something like fines of $7 billion at the moment. I really believe that they're on a slippery slope to nowhere, and I don't think they'll be capable of preventing their own demise.
Or it's gotten to the point now where you can't even have a discussion on that platform. You know, you can't even have, can't really, but they're censoring so many people on the platform. It's just going to become, boomers and mothers sharing baby photos and wedding announcements. And so... Yeah,
it's losing its relevance fast.
Yes. But I mean, here we have the opportunity to... oh, hang on. I'm breathing into my mic. I'll move that. So here we have the opportunity to talk together online, and we're getting an audience of, there's 47 people watching us now for a small channel. I'm happy with that. And then, we put the movie up there and thousands of people can see it. I mean, this month I got over 1 million minutes of view time for people there. And could that be a way to kind of reach a wider audience with, the message or the strategies that you want to get out there, rather than...
Yes, certainly. I mean, one of the things we haven't been doing well is reaching out to the grassroots. If you take an issue like climate change, for example, you can delegate your feelings of responsibility, individual responsibility, to organizations half a world away, to the UN and its Sustainable Development Goals, for example, so that you don't worry so much about, well, what's happening in my backyard and what can I do about that? But in fact, the most important thing we can be doing is giving people some insights as to what they can do in that particular, with that particular issue. I mean, you'll recall the movie by Al Gore, which is 15 years ago now, probably, An Inconvenient Truth. The inconvenient truth of that movie was that it created so much angst and anxiety amongst people, simply because we now know the truth about what's happening with the science, or close to the truth with the science, but weren't told what we could actually do about it. So it created enormous anxiety. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I'd like to say is, so grassroots movements are important because they can lead to social activism, they can lead to civil disobedience, and we're seeing that more and more in terms of the community's reaction to the ineptitude of political action. But the other thing that's important for someone like me to realize is, if we look into history at some of the revolutions that have occurred, and let's take the Renaissance in Europe, it's posited that perhaps 200 to 300 people, in other words, a critical mass of the population of people with wealth, people with ideas, artists, movers and shakers in that society, were actually responsible for allowing the Renaissance, enabling the Renaissance to happen. Today, it's posited that around the world, perhaps there might be at the most 1 million people who, if we can get their minds open to the kinds of society we need to create, would have the influence, the wealth, and the wherewithal to bring society into that change.
Well, I mean, I'd like to to ask you a question about that, particularly with your horizon scanning and the modeling that you're doing. And I mean, we're here in Australia at the moment and around the world, you've got students and children protesting on the streets. You've got people gluing themselves there. We've had a caravan of protesters come from the southern states up here to Queensland to protest in Adani mine. And
Yes.
I mean, the thing is, if you look at that in a bigger picture, they can end the project here. They'll feel happy, but then it'll be sourced. The coal will be sourced by the Indian company from a country which has a lower grade of coal. And then it will have a net negative on the environment. So they're not thinking in that the system way of thinking that needs to. And
No.
what concerns me is that I'm seeing more and more and more of an authoritarian push from a lot of the people on who are using the fear of the climate apocalypse that some people are claiming. You've got idiots saying 12 years left. I'm of the opinion it's a slow moving issue. And that humanity has the technical capability to deal with it. And I'm seeing more and more where people are just reacting without understanding the actual implications of what they're advocating for. And
That's very true.
with your scanning, because you're going for public domain and accessible documents, an example here in Australia was Peter Ridd, a professor at a university up in northern Queensland, and he was wrongfully dismissed because of his criticisms of just the media discussing the end of the barrier reef. The Great Barrier Reef is dying, and school children are terrified with it. And he actually invented the equipment that was used to measure the sediment on the reef. And he goes, well, no, this isn't true. They're not pushing everything. And
Yes.
I met with him at a conference, and I had a coffee, and I asked him, what's going on here? And he's saying that the problem is, unless your research is funded by government bodies or respected organizations, everyone assumes it's biased. So you couldn't crowdfund some research to make a counter argument. What's the risk or how do you handle bias in the sphere of open documents? Because Google is notoriously biased, or you're just seeing it there with all the results. How do you deal with that, or how do you account for that in your modeling that you prepare?
Yeah, a very good question indeed. We tried to take it into account. You can't actually eliminate bias, and there are various forms of bias. You just can't do it. So what we try to do is by focusing on that polyocularity, for example, of making sure that we have different cultures and ethnic groups represented in inputting and giving us feedback. In that kind of thing, what we're trying to do is dilute any bias that might be there. And that's frankly, that's the best we can do at this stage, because even with machine intelligence, even with AI, you get some form of inherent bias because it's been coded by humans, and humans are biased.
So it's a challenge, an ongoing challenge with.
Oh, it is. It's an enormous challenge, yes. But in terms of the example you were giving, there are so many scientists who can't be as equivocal as some other scientists are, and are being ignored because of that. And there are other groups that are much more concerned that the science is pointing to a much more dramatic and catastrophic outcome, again, than is being painted. The problem with the IPCC reports has been very much a watering down of the language to allow different countries to agree that the report is both accurate and viable in terms of their own sensibilities, I suppose. What we need to be able to do is to include different viewpoints without fear that it's going to weaken our argument for one thing or another. We need to be much more inclusive than we are, and not be fearful of that.
We're at a point now where people can risk destroying their whole career just for expressing an opinion, and Facebook is clamping down on people. If you put a paper that maybe presents an alternative view on the climate change, your group will get dissolved. So I've heard about 2 of those that have happened today. And that's one example is, for me, one of the best presenters I ever encountered at university when I was watching it online on the TED on YouTube was Hans Rosling. Yes. And where he has a statistician and a sword swallower and entertainer, and where he just shows his statistics to break down some of those misconceptions people have about this primitive third world and a glorious first world, and how a lot of the parts of African nations have developed very well, and just the onflowing effect that can have. And I'm still encountering people more and more don't have a real understanding of what's going on in the world. They'll just read the headlines and just take that, and they'll absorb that, and then they'll get emotive and worried and scared.
I think in a way that's inevitable, because we have to bear in mind that most people are trying to live their lives the best they can, to care for their families and children and their friends, and to earn a living and just do the best they can. So it's not a surprise that most try to put bad news out of their minds, and anything to do with existential potential, the potential for extinction, for example, that people are not going to think about. They don't want to think about, nor should they worry about that kind of thing, because there's nothing they can do about it.
Oh, everyone could just become stoic, adopt the old Roman philosophy, teach that at schools, and it'll be fine. It's relaxing. It makes life a lot easier when you don't worry about those things.
Well, what we need is incumbent leaders to step up to their responsibility for leading the world as a human family, not as a fractured world, but as a community of humans into a future that is going to be thriving and prosperous for everyone, with a better relationship than we have at the moment to the environment and with each other. That's what we need. We need leaders to step up. But in a recent, I think a 2 to 3 year research endeavor by Nick Gowing, who's a very dear friend of mine, who was a senior news anchor at BBC World, he interviewed over 2 to 3 years all of the top leaders in the world, in corporations, in governments, literally in every country. And what he discovered was that they don't want to say what they really believe, because they fear for their jobs or their positions, or they fear that people will not see them as leaders anymore. But almost to a person, they are really frightened about what's happening in the world, not just with the climate, but with a number of other things, like economic stratification, for example, which is leading to this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. The possibility of rogue autonomous weapons. So many different things that they're worried about, and yet they seem unable to cooperate, to come together to cooperate, to do something about that, because we're so geared up to compete.
Well, that's an evolutionary response, isn't it? We're a tribalistic, competitive species, and trying to break that down or to change that. I mean, it might be the only opportunity we have now with platforms to put information out to everyone at the planet. Might be the only chance for that to happen. But I'm a bit cynical, a bit skeptical to overcome those inherent competitive drives in people.
Yes, well, to some extent, you're right. It's human nature, and you can't change human nature. But what we need to be able to do is bring a better understanding and intelligence to bear on what we're seeing, so that we can plan a different route, change course.
Change course?
Yeah.
So moving on to your your headline grabbing topics. You mentioned the drone attacks. I mean, I'll bring it up here. We'll have a look at it here. I'll bring.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Dear, it's one, is it?
I mean, it's getting advertising. It's good for them. You're helping keep them employed. I mean, cryptocurrencies will not go away. I don't think anyone will disagree with that one. Trump will win 2020. So you predicted Trump winning previously.
Yes.
Did you put any money on it as a bet to make a profit?
No, I'm not a betting person. I've lived in poverty all my life.
No. That's your superpower, predicting the future. We'll have lots of people watching here that I know are traders and that type of thing. Put a good grand on it. Oh, right when he was at 1%.
Yeah, no, I didn't bet on it. But the key factor we were looking at there was the rise in populism around the world and the disengagement of society from the political process, from the orthodox political process. And as soon as he threw his hat into the ring, my team, almost to a man, said, look at that. Surely there can be no other result than he's going to get the presidency. And we were right.
Oh, fantastic. I think it's I've been watching a lot of Scott Adams back during the election, and he from Dilbert Comic, and he predicted it as well from a persuasion perspective, and I thought that was quite interesting, particularly getting an understanding of the hostility between the two camps over in America, the left and the right, to the point where people aren't even talking to family members. And
no, that's right.
So I mean that could be the other aspect. You're concerned with people not being politically engaged, but then they're getting to the fanatical, where there's ideologically they hate the other side, and we're getting to a point now where people can't or won't refuse to even come to a happy compromise. And we had an election here in Australia just recently, and one of the things I wanted to argue for was to shift the Overton window and to have a mix of people in our parliament, so you can have rigorous debate and discussions and kind of use our parliamentary house like they're meant to be.
Yes. Well, what is interesting in the last Australian election, because of the factors that are part of our system here, one of which is compulsory voting, apparently about 18% of people only voted because they had to. Now, when you're in that situation, you're much more, because you're not interested in policy, you're much more interested to look at television, see Scott Morrison drinking a beer and think, oh, he's a good guy, I'll vote for him. You go for style and personality over substance and policy. So interesting that things like that can sway the election, especially when it's so close.
I was told that I think 5% of people make their decision on the day with the how to vote cards. Right. They can swing 5% of the vote at the booth, the how to vote cards. So, I mean, there's a lot of people just aren't interested in politics and.
No, but that's the key. You see, if we can actually re-engage society in the political process, we've become so disenchanted because politics has become all about the politicians. It's all about themselves, and they're in this kind of bubble, and it's. I mean, the whole system is not working. Democracy is not working.
So would that be a scenario or a question you'd put towards people as an alternative to democracy? Or you couldn't challenge a bureaucrat with that? I'd imagine that'd be. I keep thinking of Yes Minister.
No, you can challenge people. I mean, I've had several friends who are in the House of Reps, and we have lengthy conversations, not necessarily arguments, too, about the pros and cons of the current system. I think the things that I would change, if I could, would be 3-year political terms, electoral terms, because that doesn't give you time to do much. I would eliminate if I could, all the personal vendettas that continue to thrive in Canberra. I would change our obsession with polling and polls because they lead to instability. And I would probably do away with even the idea that you could have a career for life as a politician. I believe public service is all about serving for a certain period and then going back to some other profession. So if we could change those kinds of things and give better information to people to be able to decide, and better technology so that the voice of the people could be heard every day rather than just once every 3 years about matters, policies that matter to them, to us, then I think you could actually reform democracy in a way which would work, or would certainly work better than it does today.
There's some people looking at, I think it was some political parties here that are advocating for a direct democracy system using a crypto backend where people would vote or exchange their votes. And my fear of that is any system like that, you'd start getting lobby groups and people would, band together, and it'll just be the same mess that we have, but even worse. So I'm worried where that could go.
There are several groups. The one I was involved with as chairman of My Vote was using a smart app, a blockchain-enabled app on the smartphone to inform people better so that they could vote on any issue. But what we tried to do as well was eliminate those kinds of possibilities for manipulation and corruption in the system. And that, it hasn't gone away. It's on a slow burn. In fact, My Vote featured fairly strongly in the Indian elections just, 5 or 6 weeks ago. And you will see it in Australia at the next federal election, where we hope My Vote will have potential candidates in every position for the Senate.
Okay. Oh, we'll have to keep an eye out for it in the next election that we have here.
You will, I'll remind you.
Fantastic. So what about, that's one, moving on to discussing your future plans and what you have going on. I mean, My Vote, that's one of your projects that you're involved with? Could you share any others with us?
I'm no longer chairman of My Vote, but yes, that was one of our proof of concept projects at Centre for the Future. The one we're focusing on two at the moment. At a global level, we're focusing on a project which we're calling Operation Peace Quest, which is a series of small experiments of different kinds, very small, some grassroots, some others not so grassroots, but the underlying function of that project is to try to repurpose the military to wage peace rather than war. So that's what we're doing at in a major way, and we're focused on the Middle East, because if essentially you say, well, where's the most difficult place to focus, and you'd have to say there's no one more difficult than that. So we're doing that, but we're also trying to address incumbent leaders, the states of mind of incumbent leaders, and this toolkit I was talking about. We want to give them an opportunity to learn different ways of being, seeing, and acting upon information that might otherwise remain invisible to them. And so we're working on how we might go about doing that.
Okay. Do you have a branding for the second project?
No, not really.
Okay.
It's early days. It's early days.
Oh, we'll have to keep informed and keep us updated with where you're going with that. I think you definitely have, well, you're jumping in the deep end with Peace Quest in the Middle East. If you can pull it off there, you can pull it off anywhere at the moment.
Yeah, but there are certain criteria. Remember, we go back to first principles. When we look to do anything at all, we're not just assuming the kinds, we're not taking for granted what exists at the moment. We're saying, let's go back and have a blank canvas and working from first principles, what would peace look like in this region? What would it entail? What would have to happen for that to work? And so, for example, one of the ideas we have at the moment is to give, because so many people use smartphones, why not give the mothers of soldiers that are fighting each other an application that so that they can talk to each other and watch closely the trajectory of those conversations. We have a feeling that that kind of small grassroots experiment would result in information and ideas, concepts, if you like, that could then be scaled up, that would be more effective for creating peace than incumbent leaders who are intent on fighting each other and need that in terms of arms trading and resource protection in order to remain in office. So what we're trying to do is very, very different.
Well, historically, that there's been circumstances in when there was a pause in the battle, in the wars, where the soldiers would come together to take away the dead, and it's
Yes.
You've got the puppet masters at the top pushing all the plebs into the meat grinder, and there's a certain camaraderie that develops in that circumstance. So it's kind of putting a modern twist on that and working the mum angle. So I think it's an innovative approach, and it'd be interesting to see what effect it could have.
Well, we're observing those kinds of things at the moment and trying to keep under the radar, because substantial change is not coming from our so-called leaders in the world. And I've explained why probably that's not the case. But we can't just wait for them to have an epiphany and see how they can do things differently. We've got to keep working at a grassroots level to try and establish what I call second order change.
Very good. So I think we should open it up for questioning. Would you like to hear from the audience?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Okay, so we've got 63 people watching. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm just having to look over here to pick the questions. Here we go. So guys, please send in any questions you have. And I'm just going through here. They're all chatting to each other because I haven't been responding to it. You kind of get people to get to know each other.
That's good too.
Yes, no, it's good. Well, I had one that was asked on Facebook previously, and it hasn't been brought up here, so I'll start with that one. One of the predictions you're making is a global economic catastrophe, or GFC2, some would say. And what are your opinions? Is there any chance of our financial systems returning back to, or monetary systems returning back to a gold standard currency?
I just think, I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. What I do see is instability in the global economy. Economists tend to ignore things that worry me, and I don't know how they can exclude them from their thinking, like personal or household debt, for example. Now, in Australia, I mean, it's the worst in the OECD and one of the highest debt levels in the world. That bothers me. That really troubles me, because if you take into account the collapse in house prices, but still stagnant wages, the real difficulty of young people in particular to get into the housing market, to save up for a deposit, especially after the results of the Royal Commission and the clampdown on the banks, in spite of, the recent blip or illusion of relaxation, you've got circumstances that are bound to disrupt, socially speaking. So for me, the question is when the collapse is going to happen. I'm predicting the middle to the end of next year. But will a collapse happen? Yes, it's inevitable.
The bubble can't last forever. But don't worry, Koshi's telling everyone to buy now. It's all gonna be good. It'll all be good.
Well, you've got to remember, especially in the Sydney and Melbourne markets, that house prices were inflated artificially by the amount of Chinese capital coming into the country. Now, Beijing just recently has laid down the laws restricting capital leaving China. So that's going to dry up. That's one factor, but there are other factors. The US-China trade war doesn't help. That's going to have an impact on it. If it's not happening now, it's going to impact us over the next few months considerably. And I don't see that coming to a halt anytime soon, not before the US election next year anyway.
I actually I looked at the foreign investment into our housing construction, and this includes apartments, and it was over 90% of new home approvals or development building certificates were from foreign investment of one sort or another. And I mean that's obviously going to overheat a sector.
It is. And you've also got investors pulling out of rental properties simply because the yields are low these days. So there are so many signals, all of which point to collapse. Now, I'm not sure actually whether there will be another global financial crisis in the same sense as there was in 2008. I'm more concerned that we escaped then, fortunately, and I don't think we're going to escape this time. I think there's going to be, you can call it a correction if you like, if you want, in orthodox terms, but I think our economy is going to go into a free fall sometime next year.
I don't think you'd be alone in that prediction.
No, it's not very smart. It's not a very smart prediction, is it?
Oh, they wouldn't. You wouldn't be popular with that one.
No.
Here we go. Enbity has asked, is there anything positive to look forward to? So he's probably been watching my channel too much with all the dire end of the world stuff. But so maybe a positive thing to look forward to.
Look, I mean, I think there are many. I mean, that I confess now here, I have 10 children and 14 grandchildren with one more grandchild on the way. So I'm doing my bit to invest in an optimistic future. There are lots of things to be optimistic about. The first is the ingenuity of humanity to get out of trouble, whatever that happens to be. That's one thing. I think now the signs that young people and women too, all around the world, are beginning to be motivated to protest old systems that no longer work for the good of the whole. That's positive. A third thing is, for many of the problems facing us, we actually do have the technologies available today. We don't need to innovate. We've got them. They are there. But I don't what it is. We seem more interested in spending billions of dollars still trying to get to Mars than and then spending trillions trashing our own home. So there is still some really weird things going on, but I think there's lots to be optimistic about.
Well, my wife is listening, and we've got 4 children, so we're Rachel, we've got to catch up.
Yes.
Here we go.
You need to run faster.
Yeah. Let's see what we got here. I'll look for some more. Oh, here we go.
Florian, with regard to that last comment, though, it's a good question, and there's a level of anxiety in the air, which is the reason for a lot of the mental health problems we have these days. There's a lot of anxiety, and I think what we need to do is promote hope and optimism more than we do.
Well, one example is in the schooling system here in Australia, and my wife is part of a sewing guild, and the other mothers come there, and their sons are coming home in tears because they're constantly badgered that they're to blame for all the problems, all these issues, and a lot of it is against an attack on men are to blame for this, and it's causing anxiety in these children. And I really question the ongoing damage this is going to cause, because we have a lot of politically motivated people who are, particularly in the intimate partner violence space, they're only presenting one argument, and that's the approach that men are always the aggressor and never the victims. And I actually interviewed two gentlemen that are trying to start up the first shelter for fathers to go with their kids to take out of a domestic violence situation there, the first one in the entire country, and people are shocked that that doesn't actually exist there. Yeah. And so I'm concerned that you're raising issues about ongoing mental health, and you're seeing more and more children are just scared and worried for the future. And this is one example where there's evidence that it's the argument they're putting forward is not correct. You can put counter arguments to them, you can put evidence and science in front of them, and it's just ignored. So
well, I think one of the problems is, I go back to what I was saying very early on in the interview, and that was the gridlock in which we find ourselves. And one of the characteristics of how we're educated is in this notion of Cartesian thinking, where we have a thesis and a counter-thesis. We have debate, where we have an argument for and against. We have left politics and right politics. It's all this duality, and duality or dualism is such a blunt instrument to deal with the complexities of life today. We need to be much more inclined to be informed differently and not just automatically classify every issue in terms of right and wrong or black and white.
But that's I think that's a natural, going back to human nature, that's a natural response. We often can't comprehend the complexities around us. We only need to know just enough to survive and make the best with it. So I see I think our education system needs to be reformed in some way to allow students to be more critical, and I think that's honestly getting missed. So we'll see. Here we go. How are we going? Come on, guys, give me some more questions. Well, Entity is happy. That's good.
Phew.
That's good. It'd be nice if schools told as little as two sides of the story. That'd be good.
Yeah.
And here we hang on. Here we go. Omnipotent Peace Man asks, how long will the recession last?
I don't know. You'll have got the gist now. People looking at this will have got the gist that I don't guess, and that's one thing I haven't looked into, the actual length of a recession, but I will.
You think it's going to be recession or depression?
It could be easily. No, it could easily be a depression. I really am worried that it could be much more than just a technical recession.
Because I'd argue that we're in recession at the moment. Well, relative to GDP per capita, it's going negative. We're losing wealth as a nation, and it feels like we're in a recession. Oh, hang on, here we go. Rachel asked me one. Luke asked about manufacturing in Australia. Well, yeah, right. Manufacturing barely exists anymore in Australia. What do you think the future is for that in our nation?
Well, one of the things we need to do is reignite our ability to manufacture appropriately and relevantly. I mean, there are many industries that we could go into, invest into, and be world leaders, but we seem so reluctant. And manufacturing is actually the platform, it's the basis for a healthy industrial society such as ours. So I don't know what the question was, but we've lost a lot of manufacturing needlessly, and we need to reinstate its importance for our society. No doubt about that.
I mean, a major export is iron ore in Australia at the moment.
Yeah, the other problem, of course, Florian, in terms of manufacturing, is that with the manufacturing we've got at the moment, which is not what it was, over the next decade, probably 65% of jobs in manufacturing will go because of automation, standardization, robots. So the real question there is, can there be a renaissance of manufacturing in new industries to compensate for that? I believe there can be, but it needs the government to really be more inclined to invest in manufacturing than it has been.
I mean, we've got our Minister of Industry. I'm afraid I can't remember her name. She's pushing for tiny houses. Now, tiny houses are essentially caravans, and they put them on a trailer bed to get around all of the building code and safety compliance requirements you need in a normal house. So your stairs and railings, it just ignores it. And she seems to think that that will create 20,000 new jobs in Australia. And for someone who's got experience working with volumetric modular construction, particularly during the mines, a lot of that will be manufactured overseas. And it's not going to come, it's not going to create 20,000 new jobs. I think that's very naive. And what's concerning is someone in that capacity is kind of what seems to me like a pet project, is putting that forward as policy. And I mean, is that what you're encountering in dealing with people at this our glorious leaders, or is it just my cynical interpretation?
No, it's not cynical. This is the reality we're dealing with, and I don't like to put the blame on individuals, because I think the world has become so complex, is so uncertain, so volatile, that we need to think very, very differently about the future. Now, unfortunately, politicians mostly they've lost the plot. It's become all about them and their entitlement to rule, and they lose the plot. And in terms of that particular case, I'm sorry if it sounds rude, but with such naivety, I would ask, who ties her shoelaces in the morning?
Oh, I'm sure we've got a $30,000 or $90,000 civil servant driver doing that. Isn't that the way it goes? One of the perks.
Probably.
I think it's attention grabbing, headline grabbing. I think that's the thing as well, because
it's foolish. I mean, it really is foolish. It's not very policy. It's not policy. It's foolish.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Here we go. So we've got, hang on, tiny housing. Here we go. We've got a super chat from Mr. E. Question: do you feel the societal degeneration is deliberate, incidental, or allowed to happen? Warmest regards from, and I'm assuming that's from Hong Kong. I know Mr. E's from Hong Kong.
Okay, so can you read it out again, because I can't see it properly?
Do you feel the societal degeneration is deliberate, incidental, or allowed to happen?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, that is a really powerful question. And I think it's a mix of all three, actually. I don't think it's that clear cut. I don't think it's one thing or the other. So very often today, we need to take a much more granular approach, because we live actually in a pluriverse, not a universe. One size doesn't fit all. So look, that is such a powerful question that I feel incompetent to give a really intelligent answer to that. It's a question that would make me think long and deep.
Oh, maybe you've got prompted now. You can go away and come back to it. It's
Yeah, I will. I'm going to take that one away. Certainly. Thank you for the question. It's so insightful, that question.
I mean, that's something that you could pull apart, because I mean, one of the issues that's happening on the world at the moment is, I mean, here in Australia we've had a significant migration come from foreign countries. In Europe, you've got migration of people shifting, and you've got different cultures coming together, and historically that's always created a conflict and issues. And one thing with your the peace quest, I could see that as one opportunity to try and create bridges between those cultural differences and allow the emergence of a new culture, or a combination or an evolution of it over time. But the problem is surviving that process.
Yeah.
And
what's happening in society at the moment is interesting in different ways. I mean, the amount of the increase in social activism, purposeful social activism, and if that is from Hong Kong, the extraordinary impact the umbrella movement is now having on Carrie Lam and her government. And I don't think that level of activism or civil disobedience is going to stop until she moves out of office, resigns. But I mean, China doesn't know what to do about this, because there are so many, the volume of people on the streets is such that all conventional responses don't make sense, even for the Chinese Politburo.
you don't think they'll put the boot down like they did in the past?
Very difficult to do that, because I forget the numbers now, but there's certainly a rise in the numbers of people, long-term residents, who've decided to apply for Canadian or Australian or British citizenship. You've got huge numbers of young people who are putting their lives on the line to say, this is not the kind of society we want, in such numbers that, at one stage, nearly 3 million. That's, what do you do in circumstances like that? You have to think very carefully of the kind of response you would enact. Now, I have done a lot of work in China in the past, and with political leaders as well, but I don't know what they're thinking these days, unfortunately.
Mr. E has let us know that the police are coordinating with Triad at the moment, because apparently they've been attacking the protesters as well.
Right, yes.
That would be interesting.
That was actually noted. It was visible.
That's concerning with what's happening. Stay safe, Mr. E. Don't party too hard.
Yeah, again, all around the world, what we're seeing is this tightening of the state's authority. And in a way, it's probably hastening a transition from the industrial society to whatever society we're moving into. It'll hasten the collapse, and it'll hasten the transition. So you could argue that what we're seeing is a necessary element in terms of transformation. But it's tough.
Well, that flows on to TD's question. Does the doc think we are in the end phase of this empire, the bread and circus phase? So are we witnessing the end of Western civilization at the moment?
I think we're witnessing the end of the extractionist paradigm. The old industrial models are no longer working. So I think we're seeing that. If you're referring to all of that world system, yeah, that's going to go. That's going to transform into something else. So in that sense, we're seeing the end of the industrial model and the beginning of something else. I hope that something else is more inclusive, more enabling for the human family as a whole, and more empathic, and leads to a better understanding of how we should relate to each other, or could relate to each other, and to the planet.
I'd like to see more individual empowerment, particularly with our manufacturing, moving from centralized fabrication more to more individualistic, fabrication and well, kind of like the old what was it? What was the movement against industrialization? I'll remember it. I'll remember it tomorrow when I wake up. But
same here. On the tip of my
going
tongue.
to the craft movement, a return to the more craft movement, but taking advantage of modern technology. I mean, here we can have an interview, we can be broadcasting to the world, and I can see that as having an opportunity. And personally, I would think the government would probably get in the way of it a little bit more. I mean, we can see with the NBN that we have here in Australia compared to what you've got in Thailand, and just how much they've buggered it up. So I'd like to see.
Just an explanation there. Before we came on air, I was explaining to Florian that I live in the far northeast of Thailand, up on the border with Laos, near the River Mekong, and I have 5G speeds there, which means download bandwidth of about 350 plus megabits per second, compared with where I'm sitting now in the CBD of Melbourne, where my speed is 12 megabits per second, believe it or not.
Yeah, well, that's one advantage to a lot of these countries. They can skip a technological level. They don't need to run copper everywhere. They can use their phone systems and get straight to this more advanced stuff.
Yes, they don't have to worry so much about legacy systems, which certainly is a cost. But I have a sneaking suspicion also that we may be, with speeds like that, we may be piggybacking on the military.
Yep. Well,
I don't mind as long as I can download a movie in 4 minutes. That's fine.
So long as they don't start censoring you. We've got a question here, a super chat from Butterstotch. What's your opinion on buying precious metals, silver or gold physical, as a hedge against the coming maybe?
Very wise. Very wise, because I do believe we're even seeing in the crypto space, for example, a move from utility tokens based on nothing but hot air or thin air, based on nothing, to sovereign tokens, where the tokenized entity or product or asset or whatever it happens to be is backed by gold or precious minerals or whatever it is. So I think that's wise move.
One thing I contemplated years ago when I was going through this this subject in university was seeing if the world could shift from the fiat currency or a gold-based currency to an energy-based currency. So you're trading with people in joules. That's a different way of measuring your productive capacity. Is that going to happen? Should I start saving up my joules?
Yes, it could. It could very well. Yes, absolutely.
We'll see here. Mr. E is bragging that he's got 10,000 megabits in Hong Kong. So
10,000.
Yeah,
okay, I'm coming to Hong Kong.
Yeah. Thanks, mate. Thanks for bragging there. Good on you. Good on you. Let's have a look. Here we go.
Actually, that's not possible. 10,000.
Yeah, you really getting that mystery, or are you just giving us BS, mate? Come on. He might be just,
That's not possible, even with 5G.
He might have fiber. He might have fiber.
Yeah. Yes.
Here we go. People are talking about gold and silver. Gold and silver. Gold and silver. Well, it looks like a lot of them are buying gold and silver and are discussing in the comments where they're getting it from.
That's fine. You should go on buying gold and silver. It's always good.
It's heavy. That's the problem. I was talking to a colleague today going, the one advantage of fiat is you can carry an envelope with money, no problem, light as a feather, but then you convert it to bullion. You're carrying around a backpack full of silver around the street.
True.
Yeah. Here we go. Here we go. Angie Rainbow wants to know your thoughts on immigration.
Oh, it depends on the time frame again. I mean, immigration, let's face it, is a scam for just getting money. It really is. It's just a way of getting money for a country through the visa system. It depends what tack you want to take on immigration. Immigration into Australia, for example, has been critical for productivity. In fact, probably 90% of productivity in Australia has been based on population growth. So immigration adds a richness to the society, which is extremely valuable. But what I was getting at with the visa system, where you've got people needing to get visas and pay for that, which is just revenue for a state, I think in the long term, the barriers, the artificial barriers around the nation state will crumble and we'll be free to move like money does. I'm not, that answer isn't very sensible, is it? I'm sorry. The question was very broad.
Well, it is a challenging issue, and well, I think you've highlighted one of the. I mean, it's a money bag, a piggy bank for the politicians. Just this stamp duty we've seen in Victoria and New South Wales with all the development there. Victoria is concerned that their stamp duty's revenue is going down, so they're going to have to increase taxes to address that. And
well, the other factor, Florian, in terms of immigration over the next 20 years or so, is going to be the rise in climate refugees. The sheer numbers are going to be mind-boggling. And for a country like Australia, that's close to a country like Indonesia, for example, the latest estimates within perhaps a 40-year time frame could be that we have 50 million people knocking on our door wanting to or needing to leave Indonesia and take up residence in a country like Australia.
See, that was the investigation they were doing with this Tuvalu project, and now it's been a decade later, and there's still no need for it. So I'm fairly confident we'll be fine. I think human innovation will solve our issues. So I guess I'm an optimist in that regard.
Well, you have to remain an optimist. The alternative is not good.
Well, yeah, that can be a little depressing, can't it?
It can. The numbers of people that I know, including some of my kids and friends who have high levels of anxiety or are clinically depressed because of what I refer to as the burden of knowledge, is frightening.
That's concerning. But I mean, you've got people in the states that are acting insane, or they've got Trump derangement syndrome, and their behavior is to the point where they're cutting off relationships with family members, and they're isolating people. And it's not normal behavior. It's not healthy behavior.
No, but the society is changing. There is no doubt about it. I mean, some of you, because of my mannerisms, some of you watching and listening may have picked up that I have Asperger's syndrome. Now, in my 73 years of life, I've learnt coping mechanisms so that I can cope with how society works. But Baroness Susan Greenfield, recently, the brain scientist in the UK, recently came out and said that she believes from her research that the amount of time young children now spend on screens, one way or another, whether it's a phone or a tablet or whatever it happens to be, is actually creating an entire generation of virtual autism, which is, well, it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm not at all surprised by that, and I mean it's concerning because your phone here, it's like you need to get a prescription to get dopamine controlling drugs. if you're depressed, they'll give you a prescription. You pop the pills, it releases your dopamine, and it affects your brain. The games are designed to do the exact same thing, and children are getting this positive feedback for going click, 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 and they're getting no social interaction. And
no, it's addictive, certainly. And physically, the blue light is a problem for macular degeneration. I mean, it's a real problem.
And I think Victorian schools have banned mobile phones now from schools, and it's one thing I worry about, because as a parent, and you've got 10 children, you know how annoying children can be, particularly in the younger years. You love them dearly, but they're copies of you, so they'll know how to push your buttons and they'll just create havoc. And it can often be tempting to just stick them in front of a screen to get some peace, and that's the problem, is when these devices they scare me more than anything, to be honest, just with that addiction they can develop to it. I'll have to look up that the doctor there and look into her research. That's concerning.
It is. On the other hand, Tony Attwood, who you may know of because he lives in Brisbane, he's one of the world's leading authorities on autism, and he reframes ASD as potentially one of the next phases in human evolution. So he puts a very positive spin on autism.
Well, it might actually give you a competitive advantage in a society where you never have to deal with any. It's all virtual, and you're interacting, and you don't need to worry about it. And
yes.
Oh. So I'm not going to say anything about my father-in-law who's watching in the room next door. Nope, I'm not going to say anything. So I'm just looking here at some more questions. Here we go. Another one from TD. How will Boris's hard Brexit affect Australia? And are we ultimately headed towards global socialism? Yes.
Okay. So the first, two questions then. I don't think Boris's Brexit is going to impact Australia much. What is much more important for us is to reconcile the relationship we have with the US and China. China being one of our major trading partners and in our region, and the US being a friend, partner for many, many years, especially where there is tension or conflict. We have to resolve that. The UK coming out of Europe, I see as so stupid. It's really a reflection on the nostalgia for a glorious past, and believing that the past can be like the future, which I don't think it will be. Now, the second part of that question is very, very interesting indeed. Florian, can you just tell me again what that?
And are we all ultimately headed towards global socialism?
Yeah. So one of the things we need to do, because I've been talking about dualism and that Cartesian logic, which automatically separates things into two opposing compartments. We need to reject that in terms of ideology. And nowadays, to talk about socialism on the one hand and conservatism on the other, in any context at all, is not helpful. It really isn't helpful. What we need to do is become much more granular around beliefs and values, and look at the world through many more, like a kaleidoscope, through many different lenses, rather than just two dominant belief systems. So no, I don't think the answer is universal socialism for the world, but it may be in particular jurisdictions.
I think the challenge you face there is how people prefer people like simple models, simple comparisons, simple sound bites. And that's going to be I think a constant uphill battle, and maybe it comes back to our education system and getting people to think a bit more critically and wider.
Yes, it does. The key, the education is the key.
JW has asked your opinion on UBI, Universal Basic Income.
Probably, well, it's interesting because the experiments that have been conducted with that so far have all been positive. The one in Finland, there was one in an African country as well, and I can't remember where it was, but in the African country where they thought people would just become lazier, what actually happened was greater levels of innovation and entrepreneurship, and a greater degree of positivism and optimism. So the experiments that have been conducted in that so far have been very, very positive indeed. If we are going to come to terms with the reality of automation and artificial superintelligence and the number of jobs disappearing, although there will be an uptake of new jobs that we can't imagine what they might be, but certainly there will be more people, if you like, unemployed for longer terms, then something like a universal basic income will be absolutely necessary.
Well, are we hitting a point where, well, frankly, the intellectual capacity to actually be a productive member of the workforce is going to be out of reach for a larger proportion of our population than it has been in the past?
Yes, it is. And, you know, for the next 2 decades, until 2040, when we get to the point of the singularity, where machines become much more intelligent and process, you know, millions of times faster than we can anything. Until that time, we need to focus on professions that humans can do better than machines, and things like empathy and compassion and creativity, relational marketing, stuff like that. You know, that work is important. Machines can't do it at the moment. Eventually they will be able to.
Kafka Kitty has asked if you believe all cultures are equal.
Do I believe all cultures are equal? Yes, I do. I mean, I've traveled the world a lot. I've worked with different cultures. There are distinct qualities cultures have, but and also there are you can generalize as there being distinct cultural mindsets that different cultures exhibit. So, for example, the Sinic or the Chinese mindset, culturally speaking, is very different from the Indic mindset, and likewise, they're both very different from the Occidental mindset. One of the problems we have these days is that most cultures and nations aspire to the Western worldview, which has given rise to the world system that we're living in today. And we're only just beginning to realize how toxic and damaging, in a pure sense, that Western worldview actually is. It would be wonderful if we could actually accept that indigenous cultures, for example, cultural mindsets and indigenous wisdom has a lot to teach us in terms of the kinds of futures we could create together now. But yes, from my point of view, I don't see any qualitative difference from one culture to another. I tend to look through the lens of the human family and see us as a species.
I'd look at culture as a evolutionary outcome, and you know, they mish and mash together and change over time, and being too tied to a previous past may be dangerous. And what I mean, you made reference to indigenous culture, and I think even contemporary here in Australia, we are getting some wisdom from certain elements of it, and it's mishing together with the Western culture that's come here, and you've got a mishmash of it. But where we've got issues, particularly with the identity politics, where they're starting to silo people into you're in this group, you're in this group, you're in this group, and then that creates divide and division. And I think it's going to be counterproductive to the aspirations you'd have of a more human perspective, because once you start isolating people, you can cause resentment, and that's what I'm worried about will happen. So we got good intentions, we'll have unintended outcomes.
Good point.
So hang on, here we go. Go on, guys, keep the questions going. Probably do 2 more. Darth is asking, sorry?
In terms of the last question, just a reflection for those people watching who are avid readers. There's a marvelous book that would interest you on the pluriverse, and I forget the title of the book, but the author is Arturo Escobar, Escobar, Arturo Escobar, and he's written this book on the pluriverse, which I find really quite extraordinary. There's another book which I find very inspiring in terms of cultural mindsets, and that is a book called Epistemologies of the South by a guy called De Souza Santos. Again, it's a remarkable book.
Okay. I'll find that and put that in the comments for people who would like to have a look. So here we're going. Here we go. TD asked, how did you predict 9/11 and the GFC? Going back to some of the more topical predictions.
Yes, this was through method that we use, and it was fairly rigorous. It was a group of people, and we tried to look at, the separate projects. So with the 9/11 thing, we'd identified, I think, about 18 targets in the West that could be targets for domestic terrorism. And we'd been examining the potential for terrorism, internal terrorism, domestic terrorism, within a group of people. We came up with different scenarios and looked at the degree of antagonism the US in particular was causing around the world. And it was just almost an inevitable outcome. You know, when you listen to a piece of music that you're familiar with, there's an inevitability about where it's going. The work we did on 9/11, there was an inevitability about it. You know, the people that were taking part in the project were saying, yes, of course, that's a distinct possibility. With the GFC, we'd actually been invited to give a presentation to bankers in New York and prepared. We did a lot of research on the kinds of things that could cause the system to collapse and create what we refer to in Australia as a global financial crisis. Things like the mortgage system in the US, credit default swaps, which are, you know, the instruments devised by the banks, the greed on Wall Street. I mean, there were a whole load of different factors, and we created a map, and the map drew us to the inevitable conclusion that sooner or later, if the structural elements didn't change, there would be a collapse. That was about 3 or 4 years before the GFC actually hit and Lehman Brothers went under.
And now we've got Deutsche Bank having fun.
Bank, yeah. Yes, absolutely. I was going to give a briefing to them in Sydney, I think, next week, but it was cancelled.
Oh no! Oh, it's
they're letting go about 18,000 people, but it's still a big bank.
Yeah, yeah. I feel sorry for the people involved. I mean, they're bankers though, so how sorry can you feel for them? But still, it's going to hurt a lot of people.
Yes, it is.
JW is asking, what is the future, nuclear or renewables?
Probably. I mean, if we were really wise, it would be a mix of everything. So renewables such as solar and wind, but particularly very, very important, especially with the costs of production coming down so dramatically. I mean, much cheaper than any new coal mine these days. But what we're averse to, and I'm very pro, are to develop the new generation molten salt nuclear reactors, which are fission, not fusion reactors, as part of the mix, because it's the cleanest form of energy that there is. And unfortunately, it's the specter of Chernobyl and Fukushima and the specter of still the mushroom cloud specter that haunts us, that seems to get in the way of logic and reason. But ideally, the future for energy is a mix of those things.
Well, there's an American TV show at the moment which is about Chernobyl, and I watch a YouTuber called Thunderfoot, and he's experienced with working in nuclear reactors, and he just tears it to pieces. He utterly tears the show to pieces, and this is going to be going out there and influencing a whole generation of people. So that's where I'm critical of a lot of the young protesters that you mentioned before, where they're full of, pip and vinegar and youthful energy, but they're only seeing one perspective of it, perhaps. Because I would love my power to be cheaper here in Australia. I can tell you that now. So we've got one from.
It's difficult with young people, though, Florian, because they are passionate about having a future. And I think what they're worried about are all the doom and gloom that's in the ether. It's just hanging in the ether at the moment. And it's unfair, and it's creating such desperation with a lot of people. And you can see that from the suicide rates.
Yeah, that's concerning. It is. And we've got one question here from Mr. E. Another super chat. He's being generous tonight. Does the guest believe it is a post-Christian era? And what does he feel the fruits of that have been? I have to jet gents back to the war zone. So that's Mr. E's last question for the night. Do you think we're in a post-Christian era? And what have the fruits of that period been, if you think we are?
I think we should be in a post-religion era. I think religions have organized religions. I'm not talking about individual faith or beliefs. I'm talking about especially the monotheistic traditions have been really damaging to humanity. And I think any society that calls itself sophisticated should not rely on superstition for anything.
Well, we've got. Right now you've got people who are like the young protesters that we're seeing in Brisbane and Victoria. They remind me a lot of the movement in America, the spiritualist movement at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, where there was a lot of prophecy of the end of times, the end of the world, a lot of fear surrounding that. To me, it seems very, very similar. So you've got these people who are fanatically devoted to a belief system, and they can't question it. They are literally isolated from their peers if they do, and it has all the similarities of a cult. You look at the warnings of a cult, whereas organized religion, the first structure built by humanity was a temple over 12,000 years ago. If you're going all the way back there, the first largest structure that could be found. So I'd say there's an inherent necessity of it, because religion and faith has existed in all isolated civilizations around the planet through history. The only time nations have abandoned it, it's ended terribly every single time.
I just think it's time to move on.
Yeah? What do you think the alternative would be?
I just think what I'm hoping for is a giant leap of consciousness of evolutionary consciousness, so that we are more advanced in our thinking and our feeling, and that we understand what is superstition and what is not.
So what's well, here we go. MamJ _ 0319 is asking, well, that's quite opposite to Dr. Jordan Peterson's perspective. What's your opinion on Peterson?
I don't really have a perspective on Jordan Peterson, other than he is very cleverly promoting his own brand and being quite deliberately provocative. I mean, in a way, he's the. I shouldn't say this because it's going back to that dualism that I don't like, but in a way, Jordan Peterson is the right's answer to Noam Chomsky. They both pursue the same kind of provocation, and it's all about Jordan Peterson or Noam Chomsky.
Okay. I think he's helped a lot of people. He's given a lot of men purpose, particularly in just the way society is at the moment, how it's structured. Have you heard?
I would agree with that, but I don't know whether it's the right way. And the problem, I think, goes back to the roots of the first feminist movement, which did a lot of good for women, but actually did quite a bit of harm for men, because we lost the certainty around our role in society, or it became very uncertain. So that allowed people, I think, like Jordan, to come and say, well, hang on a moment, we need to see this through a different lens and change the perspective on things. And I can understand that, and I agree with it. There needs to be a philosophy where we view people as people rather than through gender or ethnicity or age or whatever it is.
But I mean,
helps. I don't think
Sorry?
division helps. I don't think division helps. Classification and division, I really don't think helps. It's useful in analysis and in sorting through distinctions between one type and another, but ultimately it actually destroys the things that we have in common. And that, to me, especially at this juncture in human history, is not really very positive.
But we're a biologically, a sexually dimorphic species, and there's inherent differences between men and women. And
yeah.
I mean, even, I know Rachel's not going to like me for saying this, my wife is watching, even when she got pregnant and she got baby brain, just because of the hormonal changes, her cognitive ability to problem solve just changed overnight. And there's some advantages to appreciating the differences between the gender, because you can build from that. I'd say casting it all aside, I think, can lead to the frankly embarrassing people you see on social media, on the left, and people that are putting forward these gender doesn't exist and all of these other issues that what the third wave feminists now are fighting amongst themselves. You've got trans radical feminists fighting with the other ones, and it's just become a complete in-house. They're eating their own, so it's not really progressing at all. They feel regressive, and they're becoming very authoritarian too. They want to control your speech. They want to dictate what you can say, and I think that's going to. My fear is that a lot of this is going to lead to a more authoritarian future where our individual liberties are curtailed. We don't have the freedom to express our opinion for fear of offending someone. And you can talk to a lot of people that some of the things I would even say on my channel would get people fired from their job these days. And it's just, looking at 10, 15 years ago, that was the mainstream. And the Overton windows shifted too far to one side that the center, a reasonable compromise can't be achieved anymore. So I'd argue we need to shift it the other way to kind of balance it out.
I can live with that.
Okay, good. Here we go. So maybe one more question. Do you have time for one more question?
With time for one more question. I was just going to say, by the way, that as you know, I write books and do a lot of public speaking. And I was addressing an audience of about 250 people a few weeks ago, and someone decided to quote a passage from my first book, which was called The Management Myth. I mean, this was written years ago.
Oh, sorry, which book is this one?
It's called The Management Myth.
The Management Myth. Yep.
Yeah, that was my first book. It was a bestseller in Australia, and so she quoted this passage, and I thought about it for a moment because she said, "Well, can you explain such and such and such and such and such and such?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I think I've changed my mind. I now believe this." And she was most unhappy that I'd changed my mind.
That you changed your opinion.
Yeah.
Well, that's the danger too. You find a lot of people well, that's where it becomes more to be with ideological conformity. They want to have you in your little box and they want to control what you think, and they don't want you to grow as a person or to change your opinion.
Oh, that's right. Go back into your box.
So Lukewarm has asked your opinions on Islam.
It's a relevant question today, I suppose, and I have to ask in what context. I have two of my daughters have Muslim partners, husbands, and so I have how many grandchildren? I've just at the moment only 3 grandchildren who are being brought up in that tradition.
Well, I think the concern a lot of people has is well, with the radicalization and the aspect of it that is condoning violent acts for their own purposes, and you're seeing it in a lot of countries around the world.
Yes, we are.
And
I mean, what concerns me is fundamentalism wherever it exists, radicalized fundamentalism. That is a concern wherever it exists. I don't think we should be more concerned that it's occurring in one group or another. I think the possibility of it occurring anywhere is of concern.
well, that's the danger of ideological thinking that we mentioned before, where it's to the point where you dehumanize the other, and it's a heightened tribalism and in-group preference. And we're seeing that in religious organizations, we're seeing that in political organizations, and that's as old as humanity is.
But it's also a result of social media that we've also discussed, because an organization like Facebook derives its income from creating outrage and fear. So, and obviously politicians use that to create division in society. And it's just not at all helpful if we're to unite as a human family to face the existential problems that we face today.
I think that's a good point to end on tonight. So before we go, I will share with everyone, if they'd like to learn more, I've got your book up here, The 5 Literacies of Global Leadership.
That was the 3rd book.
3rd book?
3rd book. Yes.
It's on Amazon. That's where I found it.
Oh, I see, right, yes.
Yes.
It's a good book.
Yeah?
It's a good book. Yeah.
It's a good seller?
It's a good seller. It's the 2nd book I wrote, which was called Burying the 20th Century, was a much better book, I think, but it was an absolute flop. It was a disaster. I don't know how many copies it sold, but just a few hundred.
So, and I've got your website here, and I'll give links to this where people can find your about you.
Yes.
And they can also jump to your Melbourne event, which is on the 29th of August, and they can get their tickets here. And I'll link to all of this in the comments, guys. And then
Sydney the next day.
Melbourne is on 29th, Sydney's on the 30th.
Yes, that's right.
Do they at least take care of you when you go to these events? You know, good food, good accommodation, the royal treatment?
Yes.
You wouldn't have any security concerns at your event? They're not people coming to protest you,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
yes?
Oh, yes. There've been occasions where my life has been threatened. Yes.
It's just a wonderful world we're in today, isn't it? Where people can't even go and discuss ideas without being threatened or without being. I mean, it's getting depressing. It really is.
Mm.
Oh, thank you very much for joining me tonight, Richard. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who watched us. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just been a great pleasure, and I hope the people who joined us got something out of it.
So, yep, they're saying, oh, here we go. Yep, interesting, very appreciated. So, yep, they're all happy. They're all happy.
Good. Good.
So thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who was watching, and I will see you all tomorrow again. Take care, guys. Bye.
Take care. Good night.